Good morning, everyone, on the fourth Sunday of Lent 2021. Before I begin, remember to be in prayer for our Pastor Holly as she is out of town dealing with her mother in that medical crisis. And also remember to pray for Holly's continued healing as she deals with the physical challenges that she herself has faced in this past year. It's also worth noting that it was just about exactly a year ago today that we last met in person. And this pandemic has, of course, dragged on far longer and with far more impact than any of us could have imagined a year ago. And we can only pray fervently that it will soon come to an end and we can once again gather in our sanctuary and worship as we like to do. Until then, we continue to keep in touch with one another and to build one another up the best we can by these weekly videos and other ways that we have come up with to stay in touch with one another. I want to read this morning a passage from the Lectionary in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, starting in verse 4. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around to the land of Edom. But the people became impatient on the way. Then the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. Now, this is a peculiar and puzzling story from the Old Testament in some ways, but also sadly a familiar scenario that the nomadic descendants of Jacob had visited before. In a nutshell, the passage relates yet another episode in which the wandering Israelites, on that long journey from slavery in Egypt to the founding of the Israelite nation promised to Abraham, acted in a manner unworthy of God's chosen people. They began to grow weary of the wilderness and its hardships, and they complained. They accused both God and Moses of trying to kill them, or at least to make their lives hard. They griped about the food that had been provided. They even started to think that slavery in Egypt hadn't been such a bad thing after all. Then, the story tells us, God sent an invasion of snakes into the camp, and the snakes began to bite people, and some people died. After just a little bit of that, the people got repentant and asked Moses to intervene with God on their behalf. Moses took their prayers to God, and God presented a solution. Although probably not the solution that they had in mind, he didn't take the snakes away, not instantly anyway, but he had Moses cast a bronze replica of a serpent and raise it on a pole in the middle of the camp, and said that those who were bitten by a serpent could look at the bronze serpent and be healed of the bite. Well, you might say it's a fairly simple story. There's a bunch of people who get grouchy and disrespectful, and then they get what's coming to them until they straighten themselves out. But as a thought on this, I realize that this story may have a bit more of a profound message for us And maybe it's a message that we need to hear right now in Lent of 2021. Stay with me and I'll explain what I'm talking about. First of all, I'd like to suggest that the worst problem that the Israelites had was not the snakes at all. In fact, you could just about tell the story without the snakes, and it would still be a good story. The real problem affecting the people of Israel was a spiritual problem. After a very long time of wandering in the wilderness, after enduring heat and cold, drought and hunger and thirst, fatigue from the walking and the constant upkeep of their camp, experiencing illness, death, childbirth, and all the things that people experience as time goes by, regardless of who they are or where they're going. After all that, they were losing their spiritual focus. Ideally, they should have been remembering how God miraculously brought them out of slavery in Egypt. They should have been focusing on how God had provided food and water for them on many occasions and sustained them with the manna from heaven throughout their journey. They should be remembering how God had protected them from their enemies and kept them together all this time. He had even visited them on Mount Sinai and had given them through Moses a law and a covenant and was leading them to a magnificent land where they would found the nation that had been promised to their ancestors. Instead, they began to entertain fear, anger, and bitterness in their hearts, resulting in serious harm to their own spirits. When things like this are allowed to rule in a person's heart, faith takes a beating. And if we're honest, we really can't be too hard on them because we all know what it's like to get impatient with God. This past year of forced isolation and hardship has been tough on all of us. And I know many folks whose faith has been sorely tested. I know that my own faith has been tested, and maybe yours has too. So we can identify with this cranky, disrespectful, impatient, ungrateful bunch, can't we? I know that many times in the past year I have let my own mind wander into fear and anger, even bitterness over what we have all lost because of this pandemic. And I have sometimes let those negative feelings crowd out the feelings of gratitude and awe that are so essential in our hearts if we want to maintain a healthy spiritual life. But what comes next in the story is the kicker. You see, when Moses prayed to God for the people, God didn't remove the snakes at all, not immediately anyway. Instead, he gave Moses a very strange set of instructions. He told him to make a bronze snake, which almost seems to go against one of the commandments that God had given to Moses on that mountain, and to raise it on a pole, a near act of idolatry, similar to some of the pagan acts that the Israelites had witnessed and had seen their Egyptian captors do. And God told the people that the way to be healed from the serpent's bite was to simply look at the bronze snake on the pole. It really is a peculiar story if you think about it. But could there be some spiritual lesson that God wanted to teach them and to pass on to us? I think so. Perhaps what God wanted to teach the people was that in order to be healed from their spiritual sickness, the bitterness that had taken over their hearts, they had to do spiritually what they had to do physically in order to recover from the serpent's bite. You see, the bite of that serpent left a burning, fiery wound in their flesh that would lead to death. And the bitterness that had filled their hearts was leaving a wound in their spirits that would lead to spiritual death. And so just as they needed to look at a replica, an image of that serpent that had bitten their flesh, they needed to look at and recognize and accept and own up to the spiritual harm that they were doing to their spirits with their bitterness and their anger. And once they recognized and faced and owned up to that bitterness, only then could they be healed. When you think about it, that's exactly what Lent is all about. Learning how to be honest about what is in our hearts that is making us spiritually unwell. How to recognize those harmful attitudes and emotions and grudges and anger for exactly what they are. And only when we can see these things clearly, accept the reality of what they are and how harmful they are to our spirits, can we finally find healing in our hearts. I pray that God may help each one of us in this season of Lent to fully see and own up to whatever is in our own hearts that may be poisonous to our spirits, and that in seeing these things we may find healing. Thanks be to God.